At 71 years old, Eleanor Vance stood on the rain-slicked gravel of her family's estate and watched a silver Mercedes disappear behind the iron gates. But what her siblings Marcus and Lydia didn't know what they were, too blinded by their own sudden wealth to see, is that the derelict ruin they had dumped on Eleanor was the only piece of land that held the truth of their entire bloodline. They believed they had stripped her of her dignity and her future, but the miracle waiting inside that rotted Victorian workhouse would soon bring the entire town to its knees. If you've ever felt that your years of quiet loyalty were treated as a mere convenience by those you loved, if you've been discarded by your own family because you were no longer useful to their ambitions, or if you've wondered if a lifetime of sacrifice was all for nothing, this story is for you. Subscribe to the channel right now, because what Eleanor discovered when she finally turned the rusted iron key in that heavy oak door will make you believe that the universe always keeps a record of who did the work. The wind caught the hem of Eleanor's navy wool coat. The fabric was thin at the elbows and the cuffs were beginning to fray. She held a single cardboard box against her chest. It was the only thing she had been allowed to take from the house where she had lived for 7 decades. Inside the box sat a chipped teacup, a stack of old letters, and a heavy iron ring of keys with a rusted brass tag that simply read, "Records." Her father had pressed that ring into her palm 2 days before his heart finally gave out. He hadn't spoken. He had only looked at her with a clarity that seemed to bypass his failing body. Eleanor shifted the weight of the box. Her knees ached with a dull, rhythmic throb that had become her constant companion since she turned 65. She thought about the silver Mercedes and the way Marcus had checked his gold watch, while the attorney read the final clauses of the revised will. He had not looked at Eleanor once. Lydia had spent the entire meeting reapplying a layer of peach-colored lipstick in the reflection of her phone screen. When the attorney reached the part about the workhouse, Lydia had let out a small, sharp laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "It's a clean break, Eleanor," Marcus had said as they walked to the car. He didn't offer to carry her box. "The workhouse is yours, and the estate is ours. It's what's best for everyone, really." He had called it a gesture of concern, a way for her to have her own space after a lifetime of service. But Eleanor knew the truth. She had been 34 years old when she moved back into the north bedroom to care for her mother. She had traded her career as an archival assistant for a life measured in medicine schedules and sponge baths. That life had lasted 20 years. She had sold her own small downtown apartment in 2012 to fund the startup Marcus swore would make them all millionaires. The money disappeared into his research and development and was never mentioned again. For the last 30 years, she had managed the billing and the payroll for the family's timber investments. She had worked from a small desk in the drafty hallway of the main house. She had never once asked for a salary because she believed the family estate was a collective trust. She had been the one who stayed when the roofs leaked and the taxes came due. She had been the one who held her father's hand while Marcus was in Dubai and Lydia was in Saint-Tropez. Now, she stood on the edge of a marshy road with $42.12 in her purse. The silence of the afternoon was heavy. The smell of damp earth and rotting leaves rose from the ditches. The workhouse sat 3 miles down the road, a skeletal structure of grey brick and shattered glass that the town had tried to forget 50 years ago. Everyone called it a disgrace. The siblings had laughed when they handed her the deed, calling it her new kingdom. Eleanor reached into her pocket and touched the iron key ring. The rusted brass tag was cold against her skin. She looked down at the gravel. She didn't cry. She didn't scream at the grey sky or the empty road. She simply adjusted her grip on the cardboard box and began to walk. The Mercedes was long gone. The only sound was the crunch of her own sensible black shoes against the stones. She was 71 years old, and for the first time in her life, she had nowhere to go but forward. She kept walking. Eleanor Vance was 71 years old, and her hands were the only ledger that truly mattered. She walked along the narrow shoulder of the road, her black shoes kicking up small plumes of grey dust. Every step reminded her of the decades she had spent standing still so that others could run. She had been a rising star at the county archives in her late 20s. She loved the scent of aged parchment and the cool weight of leather-bound volumes. But in the winter of 1989, her mother had fallen on the ice and never truly stood up again. Eleanor had packed her books and moved back into the north bedroom of the family estate. She had stayed for 20 years. She had learned the exact timing of morphine drops and the specific way to turn a body to prevent sores. She had watched the seasons change through the glass of her mother's window while Marcus finished business school in London. She had folded 1,000 loads of laundry while Lydia toured the Mediterranean on a graduation gift their father could barely afford. When her mother passed, Eleanor had tried to reclaim her own life, but Marcus had arrived at a diner in the autumn of 2012 with a folder full of projections and a desperate look in his eyes. He needed capital for a tech startup. Eleanor had sat in that vinyl booth and signed the deed to her own small downtown apartment. It was the only thing she truly owned. She had handed him the equity from 20 years of quiet saving. Marcus had kissed her cheek. For the next 30 years, Eleanor had occupied a small mahogany desk in the drafty hallway of the main house. She had managed the billing and the payroll for the family's timber investments. She had tracked every cent that went into the estate. She had tracked every dollar that Marcus spent on his divorces. She had never asked for a salary. She believed that the work itself was her stake in the family's future. She thought the ledgers she filled at night were a promise. Her father had sat with her at that desk many times. He would place his hand over hers and tell her that she was the only one he could trust with the truth. He had looked at her that way on the night he died. He had reached under his pillow and pulled out the iron ring of keys. He had pressed the rusted brass tag into her palm. He didn't have the breath for a long explanation. He only whispered one word, "Records?" Eleanor shifted the cardboard box in her arms as the first raindrops began to fall. The memory of his voice was clearer than the sound of the wind. She remembered the way he had ignored Marcus and Lydia when they came to his bedside. He had waited until they left the room to give her the keys. At the time, she hadn't understood. She had assumed the keys were for a cabinet in the study or a chest in the attic. She didn't realize they were inheritance. He had known that Marcus would find a way to claim the house. He had known Lydia would take the silver and the art. Eleanor reached into her pocket and felt the cold metal of the key ring. The brass tag was rough. She lived her life by those keys now. Her checking account held exactly $42.12. She had no home, no job, and no family that would answer her calls. She thought about the small desk in the hallway. She had left a half-empty box of Earl Grey tea in the top drawer. She had left her favorite sweater on the back of the chair. Marcus had told her he would have a service move her things, but she knew they would end up in a dumpster. To them, she was just another piece of old furniture that no longer fit the aesthetic of their new lives. They saw a woman who had spent her best years in a sick room and a drafty hallway. They saw a woman with no power. The rain began to soak into the shoulders of her wool coat. The workhouse appeared through the mist like a jagged tooth against the skyline. It was a 3-story mass of Victorian brick, choked by thick vines, and surrounded by a rusted perimeter fence. The roof had collapsed in the east wing. Most people in town avoided this road. They called the building a shadow on the landscape. But as Eleanor approached the gate, she didn't see a ruin. She saw the destination her father had chosen for her. She saw the place where the records were kept. She stopped at the rusted gate and looked at the lock. The air in Mr. Sterling's office smelled of expensive leather and stale coffee. Rain drummed against the tall, arched windows that looked out over the city. Marcus sat to Eleanor's left, wearing a tailored navy suit and silver cufflinks that caught the dim light. Lydia sat to her right, draped in a cashmere wrap the color of a winter sky. Eleanor sat between them in her old navy coat, her hands folded tightly over her purse. She was 71 years old, and she felt like a ghost haunting her own life. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. He looked at the thick stack of legal documents on the mahogany table. "We're just being realistic, Eleanor," Marcus said, his voice smooth and rehearsed. He didn't look at her. He was busy buffing a small scuff on his shoe with the hem of his trouser leg. "The main estate is a massive liability for a woman living alone. We're worried about you," Lydia added, though her eyes were glued to her phone screen. She was scrolling through a gallery of luxury condos in a city 300 miles away. "At your age, you simply can't manage the maintenance." Eleanor watched Lydia's thumb move rhythmically across the glowing screen. Her sister didn't even look up when the lawyer began to read the final distribution. "The primary mansion and the surrounding 10 acres to Marcus Vance," Mr. Sterling read. Marcus leaned back in his chair and adjusted his tie. "The timber holdings and the commercial real estate portfolio to Lydia Vance." Lydia paused her, scrolling for a fraction of a second. She didn't smile, but her shoulders relaxed. "And regarding the final property," the lawyer continued, his voice dropping an octave, The derelict Victorian workhouse at Blackwood Marsh is bequeathed to Eleanor Vance. The room went silent, except for the rain on the glass. Eleanor felt the heavy iron ring of keys in her purse through the thin fabric. She thought about the 30 years she had spent managing the books for those timber holdings. She thought about the nights she had spent up with their mother while Marcus travelled. She thought about the equity she had given Marcus for his failed business. Lydia let out a small, sharp sigh. "It's a clean break, Eleanor. It's what's best for everyone." Marcus checked his gold watch. "We're not being cruel, we're being practical." He stood up and began to gather his leather briefcase. "You should have planned better for your own retirement, Eleanor. This is what happens when you live your whole life without thinking ahead." He said it as if she had spent those 40 years on a vacation rather than in their father's hallway. Then came the inventory of loss. The mansion to Marcus, the timber holdings to Marcus and Lydia, the investment portfolios to Lydia, the family name and the primary estate to the siblings. While they exchanged victorious glances, already planning how to spend their inheritance, Eleanor received what they called the rest, a pile of rotting bricks and a title deed for a ruin no one wanted. Marcus paused at the door. "You're not getting nothing, Eleanor. You're getting a property." He spoke the word as if he were handing her a diamond instead of a death sentence. Lydia stood up and smoothed her wrap. "I have a lunch meeting at 1. Marcus, are we done?" She walked past Eleanor without a word. She didn't offer a hug or a ride or even a glance. She simply walked out, her heels clicking a sharp rhythm on the marble floor. Marcus looked at Eleanor one last time. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." He followed Lydia out of the room. Eleanor sat alone at the massive mahogany table. Mr. Sterling looked at her with a brief flash of something that might have been pity. He pushed the iron key ring across the table toward her. The rusted brass tag scratched the polished wood. Eleanor picked up the keys. Her fingers were steady. She looked at the empty chairs where her siblings had sat moments before. She thought about the way Marcus had checked his watch while her world ended. She thought about Lydia's peach-colored lipstick. She stood up and buttoned her coat. "I will take the property," Eleanor said quietly. She didn't look at the lawyer. She didn't look at the papers. She walked out of the office and into the cold rain. The door clicked shut. Eleanor sat on the damp wooden bench of the bus shelter. The rain had tapered off into a cold, hanging mist that clung to her wool coat. She opened her floral wallet and counted the bills one last time, $42.12. She checked the small zippered pocket of her purse for any forgotten coins. There were none. This was the total sum of 71 years of life. She looked at her phone. The screen stayed black. There were no missed calls from Marcus. There were no messages from Lydia. The last notification was a week old. It was a reminder for a physical therapy appointment she could no longer afford to attend. She tapped the power button, but the battery was at 4%. The silence of the device felt like a physical weight pressing against her chest. She reached into her cardboard box and touched the iron ring of keys. The rusted brass tag felt cold and jagged against her palm. She thought about the local women's shelter near the town square. She thought about the public library where she could sit until closing time. But then she looked at the deed sitting on top of her old letters. The address was for the very edge of the county. She stood up slowly. Her right knee made a sharp, audible clicking sound. A dull, throbbing ache settled into her lower back and refused to move. She picked up her box and began to walk away from the town centre. The pavement eventually gave way to uneven gravel. The gravel gave way to the soft, black mud of the marsh road. The air changed here. It smelled of salt, wet cedar, and ancient silt. The Victorian workhouse appeared through the fog like a jagged silhouette. It was a mountain of grey brick and dead vines. The windows were hollow and dark. The roofline was broken in several places, exposing the rafters to the sky. She reached the front gate. A heavy rusted chain was wrapped around the iron bars. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the keys. The brass tag was a promise she intended to keep. She was still here. At 71 years old, Eleanor Vance felt her legs finally go on strike. She reached the iron perimeter fence just as the mist turned into a steady, punishing rain. The gate was a tangle of rusted Victorian scrollwork and thick, prehistoric-looking ivy. A heavy chain was looped through the bars, secured by a padlock that looked like a solid block of orange rust. Eleanor leaned her forehead against the cold iron and breathed in the scent of wet metal. The workhouse was worse than the photographs in the legal files. The east wing had no roof at all. Blackened rafters pointed at the sky like the ribs of a giant, dead animal. Vines had forced their way through the mortar of the bricks, cracking the foundation in long, jagged lines. "I wouldn't touch that lock if I were you," a voice called out from the mist. Eleanor jumped, her heart hammering against her ribs. An elderly man in a faded yellow raincoat and a flat wool cap stood 10 feet away. He held a thermos in one hand and a heavy flashlight in the other. "It's mostly rust and spiders," he said, walking closer. He had the slow, measured gait of a man who had walked these roads for a lifetime. "I'm Arthur," he said, tipping his cap. "I was the postman out this way for 42 years before I retired." He looked at Eleanor, his eyes narrowing behind thick spectacles. "You're a Vance, aren't you? You have your father's chin." Eleanor tightened her grip on her cardboard box. "I am Eleanor," she said. Arthur nodded slowly, as if he had been expecting this specific answer for a long time. "We've been waiting for you, Eleanor Vance. Your father told me to keep an eye on the road back in '98. He said a woman with a brass tag would come through eventually." He gestured toward a small general store with a faded blue awning visible through the trees. "The town hasn't touched this place since the fire of '52. They say it's a disgrace. But your father, he used to come out here every Sunday night." Arthur reached into his pocket and pulled out a small can of lubricant. He sprayed the padlock without being asked. "Try your key now," he said quietly. Eleanor pulled the iron ring from her pocket. The rusted brass tag caught a stray glint of light. She inserted the long, heavy key into the lock. It didn't turn at first. She pressed her weight into it, her shoulder aching with the effort. The metal groaned. The lock snapped open with a sound like a pistol shot. Arthur helped her pull the heavy chain free. The gates swung inward, screaming on their hinges. "The main door is around the back," Arthur said, stepping back into the rain. "The front hall is nothing but rot and bird nests. Go through the kitchen entrance. It's the only part that still holds the heat." He didn't ask why she was there with a single box. He didn't ask where her car was. "I'll be at the store if you need a candle or a bucket," he added. Eleanor watched him disappear back into the fog. She walked up the overgrown drive, her shoes sinking into the black mud. She reached the heavy oak door at the rear of the building. The wood was scarred and weathered, but it felt solid. She turned the key. The door opened. The kitchen of the workhouse was a cavern of cold stone and smelling of damp ash. Eleanor pushed the heavy oak door shut and leaned against it, her breath coming in short, ragged bursts. The air was so cold it felt like needles in her lungs. She set her cardboard box on a scarred wooden table that was thick with decades of dust. A single window above the iron sink was cracked, letting in a thin, whistling draft of salt air. Eleanor's right knee throbbed with a sharp, rhythmic heat that made it difficult to stand. She sat on a rickety stool and gripped her kneecap with both hands, trying to rub the pain away. Her fingers were stiff, and the joints were swollen into angry red knots from the long walk in the rain. She reached into her box and pulled out a small, battery-powered flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing walls of soot-stained brick and a floor of uneven flagstones. In the corner sat a massive cast-iron stove, its belly cold and choked with bird nests. Eleanor stood up and began to move with a slow, deliberate caution. She found a pile of old burlap sacks in a pantry and used them to plug the crack in the window. She used a discarded piece of plywood to cover a hole in the floorboards where the wood had rotted through. Every movement cost her a sharp jolt of pain in her lower back and shoulders. She didn't have a bed, so she dragged several burlap sacks into a corner near the stove. She laid her navy wool coat over the sacks to create a makeshift mattress. Arthur appeared at the back door just as the light began to fail entirely. He didn't knock. He simply pushed the door open and set a small bag of charcoal and a gallon of water on the floor. "The well pump is rusted solid," he said, his voice gravelly in the quiet room. "You'll need this for the night." He looked at the burlap sacks in the corner, but made no comment on her living conditions. "There's a storm coming off the marsh," he added. "Keep the stove door cracked so you don't choke on the smoke." He turned and left before Eleanor could find the words to thank him. By midnight, the rain had turned into a violent assault on the broken roof of the east wing. Water began to pour through the ceiling of the kitchen in 3 different places. Eleanor scrambled to find containers, using her chipped teacup and 2 rusted tins she found in the pantry. The plink of water hitting the metal was the only sound in the darkness. She sat on her pile of sacks and pulled her knees to her chest. She felt the cold rising from the stone floor, settling into her bones and refusing to leave. She pulled her phone from her pocket and checked the screen. 0%. The black glass reflected nothing but her own tired eyes. She thought, I am 71 years old and I am sleeping on a floor of burlap and soot. She thought about the $42.12 in her purse. It was not enough for a hotel room. It was not enough for a bus ticket to the city. It was certainly not enough to fix a roof that was disappearing piece by piece into the marsh. The math of her survival was too large to look at directly. This is where it ends, she thought. Not tonight, but soon. This is what it looks like to be discarded by the people you raised. She looked at her hands in the dim light of the flashlight. They were shaking, and she couldn't make them stop. She considered walking back to the road and waiting for a police car to find her. She considered calling Marcus from a payphone and begging for a room in the basement. Then, a small movement caught her eye near the base of the stove. A tiny brown wren had hopped out from behind a loose brick. The bird was soaked, its feathers matted and grey. It shook itself dry and began to peck at a stray bit of grain on the stone floor. The bird didn't look for a way out. It didn't scream at the storm. It simply adjusted itself and began to clean its wings. Eleanor stood up from the floor. Her back screamed, but she ignored it. I am not dying in this kitchen, she said aloud. Her voice sounded strange and hollow in the empty room. I am not dying because Marcus and Lydia decided I was a liability. I still have the keys. She grabbed the heavy iron ring from the table and gripped it until the metal bit into her palm. She found a broom made of stiff straw and began to sweep the soot from the hearth. She didn't stop until the stones were clear. The basement of the workhouse was a shallow pool of black water. Eleanor stood on the bottom step, holding her flashlight in one hand and her iron keys in the other. The air down here was different from the kitchen. It didn't smell of rot or wet soot. It smelled of dry stone, old cedar, and the metallic tang of a closed vault. She followed the sound of a steady, heavy drip coming from the far corner. A section of the foundation wall had shifted during the night. A massive oak shelving unit, once used for storing heavy iron pots, had finally surrendered to the damp. It had tipped forward, splintering against the flagstones. Behind where the shelf had stood for a century, there was a small door made of reinforced steel. It was set deep into the limestone foundation, no larger than a bread box. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. She looked at the heavy iron ring in her hand. She looked at the rusted brass tag that read records. Her hands began to tremble so violently that the flashlight beam danced across the ceiling. She stepped off the last stair and into the cold water. It soaked through her shoes and bit at her ankles. She didn't feel the cold. She reached the steel door and wiped away a thick layer of grey grime with her sleeve. There was a single keyhole, shielded by a sliding brass cover. Eleanor took a deep, shuddering breath. Her chest felt tight, as if the air in the basement had suddenly become too heavy to lift. She selected the smallest key on the ring, the one with the most intricate teeth. She slid it into the lock. It fit perfectly. She didn't turn it immediately. She leaned her forehead against the cold steel and closed her eyes. I'm here, Father, she whispered. The sound of her own voice made her heart hammer against her ribs. She turned the key to the right. The mechanism didn't groan or resist. It moved with a silent, oiled precision that felt like a miracle in this ruin. A heavy bolt slid back with a dull thud. The door swung outward on hidden hinges. Inside the wall was a small, stone-lined chamber that was perfectly dry. It was lined with lead to keep out the moisture of the marsh. On a single cedar shelf sat a massive, leather-bound volume. The leather was dark mahogany, cracked with age, but remarkably intact. Across the spine, embossed in fading gold leaf, were the words, The Great Distribution, County Ledger, 1852. Eleanor reached out, her fingers hovering an inch from the cover. She withdrew her hand, then reached out again. She pulled the book from the shelf. It was heavier than it looked, nearly 20 pounds of dense, high-grade parchment. She carried it back to the stairs, sitting on the third step where the light was better. She opened the cover. The first page was a hand-drawn map of the entire valley. The ink was a deep, rich indigo that had not faded in over 170 years. She turned the pages slowly. Each one was a masterpiece of calligraphy and legal precision. Every farm, every timber lot, and every residential acre was documented here. She found the section for the Vance holdings. She read the coordinates listed for the primary estate. Then she read them again. She closed her eyes and counted to 10. She opened the book and read the entry a third time. The boundaries listed in the Great Ledger did not match the deeds Marcus had shown the attorney. They weren't even close. According to this ledger, the timber holdings Marcus had claimed were actually communal town land, and the workhouse property the disgrace her siblings had discarded didn't end at the fence line. It extended 4 miles to the north, encompassing the very limestone quarry Marcus was planning to sell. The legal weight of the book felt like a live wire in her lap. This wasn't just a family record. This was the original land distribution for the entire town. It was the only surviving copy. Without this book, the town's modern property lines were built on air and assumptions. Eleanor ran her calloused fingers over the signature at the bottom of the page. It was her great-great-grandfather's hand. He hadn't been a simple worker. He had been the town's first surveyor and its official record keeper. Her father hadn't given her a ruin. He had given her the keys to the truth. They were wrong, she said to the empty basement. Her voice was steady now. She looked at the iron keys sitting on the wet step. She looked at the book that could bankrupt Marcus and Lydia with a single phone call. She didn't feel like a discarded 71-year-old woman anymore. She was the guardian of the valley's history. Everything was about to change. Eleanor Vance did not wait for the sun to rise before she began to move. She walked to Arthur's general store at the first light of dawn. She placed her remaining $42.12 on the wooden counter. Arthur did not say a word as he gathered a bag of lime, a gallon of white vinegar, and 2 heavy-duty scrub brushes. He reached under the counter and added a pair of thick leather work gloves and a box of long matches. "I have a cousin who does masonry work," Arthur said, leaning over the counter. "He's looking for some old timber from the 1850s to finish a restoration project in town. I told him you had an east wing full of it." Eleanor looked at the supplies on the counter. "I can't pay for labor, Arthur," she said quietly. Arthur tapped the side of his nose. "He's not looking for money. He's looking for the wood. You give him the rot, he'll fix your roof." Eleanor nodded once and carried her supplies back to the workhouse. She spent the next 14 days on her knees. She scrubbed the black soot from the kitchen flagstones until the natural blue slate reappeared. The stone was cool and smooth under her fingers. She used the vinegar and a wire brush to remove the rust from the massive iron stove. By the end of the first week, her hands were so swollen she couldn't form a fist. She soaked them in cold water from the well every night. She wrapped her lower back in a scavenged wool blanket to keep the muscles from seizing. The physical toll was a constant, throbbing heat in her joints. But as the grime disappeared, the building began to change its tune. The air in the kitchen no longer smelled of damp ash and ancient neglect. It smelled of sharp vinegar and the clean, mineral scent of scrubbed limestone. Eleanor turned her attention to the small room behind the basement wall. She carried buckets of water down the stairs, one by one, until the floor was clear of silt. She used the lime to patch the gaps in the masonry where the damp had tried to enter. She found a discarded mahogany table in the hallway and dragged it into the kitchen. She spent 3 days sanding the wood until the deep red grain glowed in the dim light. On the 10th day, Arthur's cousin arrived with a truck and 2 helpers. They worked for 3 days, stripping the rotted rafters from the east wing. In exchange, they patched the holes in the kitchen ceiling and replaced the broken window. The disgrace was being dismantled and rebuilt at the same time. Eleanor watched the progress from the back door. She saw the way the new shingles caught the afternoon light. She saw the way the white plaster in the kitchen made the room feel twice as large. The building was no longer a ruin that was waiting to fall. It was a structure that was learning how to stand again. Eleanor cleared the vines from the exterior brickwork using a rusted garden trowel. She discovered that the grey bricks were actually a deep, burnt orange. She worked until her navy wool coat was stained with white lime and red dust. She didn't look like a woman who had been discarded. She looked like a woman who was carving a home out of a graveyard. One afternoon, the clouds over the marsh finally broke. A single beam of golden light came through the new kitchen window. The light hit the center of the blue slate floor. The stone didn't just reflect the sun. It seemed to hold it deep within the grain. The room was silent, except for the distant cry of a marsh bird. Eleanor stood in the center of the kitchen and looked at her hands. The leather gloves were shredded at the fingertips. Her skin was stained and her nails were broken. But the room around her was whole. By the following spring, the grey skeleton of the workhouse had grown a new skin. Eleanor Vance stood in the center of the kitchen, her 71-year-old reflection appearing in the polished glass of the new window. She no longer wore the navy wool coat with the frayed cuffs. She wore a sturdy canvas apron over a clean denim shirt she had bartered from Arthur for a day of inventory work at the store. The air in the kitchen smelled of beeswax, cedar, and the particular sweetness of a garden that was finally breathing again. Eleanor had cleared the briars from the south wall and found a row of dormant rose bushes. They were blooming now, a pale, stubborn pink against the orange brick. She thought, I am not the woman who sat in the hallway waiting for a phone to ring. She realized she had spent 40 years being a shadow in other people's lives. Now, she was the one who held the lamp. The first visitor arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. It was a young woman named Sarah, the town's middle school history teacher. She didn't come with a check or a bag of donated clothes. She came with a notebook and a look of intense curiosity. Arthur said you found something, Sarah said, standing on the threshold of the blue slate floor. Eleanor didn't lead her to the kitchen table. She led her down the clean basement stairs to the limestone chamber. The great ledger sat on its mahogany table under a soft, warm lamp. Sarah didn't speak for 10 minutes as she turned the heavy parchment pages. Her hands were shaking. This changes the map of the entire county, Sarah whispered. The town council has been arguing over the marsh boundaries for 3 decades. This ledger is the only legal proof of the original deeds. Word began to move through the town like water through a dry creek bed. People began to appear at the back door. A farmer came to see the coordinates of his grandfather's original orchard. A young couple came to find the hidden spring that was mentioned in the 1852 survey. Eleanor didn't charge them money. She made tea in her chipped cup and sat with them at the mahogany table. She showed them their own history, 1 page at a time. The community didn't offer her charity. They offered her recognition. They called her the archivist. They brought her fresh eggs, jars of honey, and bundles of firewood in exchange for her time. The workhouse was no longer a disgrace that people avoided on the marsh road. It was a destination. Eleanor felt a sense of peace that had nothing to do with comfort. It was the feeling of a heavy key finally finding the right lock. She looked at her work-worn hands and didn't see age. She saw the tools of a protector. She was still here. The sound of the silver Mercedes on the gravel drive was a sharp, discordant note in the quiet of the marsh. Eleanor was in the kitchen, carefully wiping a stray speck of dust from the mahogany table. She didn't startle at the sound of the car door slamming. She didn't look out the window to see who had arrived. She knew the rhythm of that specific engine. Marcus walked into the kitchen first, his polished Italian loafers looking absurd on the blue slate floor. Lydia followed him, her eyes darting around the room with a mixture of confusion and sudden, sharp interest. "Eleanor," Marcus said, his voice dropping into that familiar, honeyed tone of sibling concern. "We heard some rumors in town about a discovery you made." He walked toward the center of the room, looking at the newly plastered ceiling and the restored iron stove. "We're just being realistic, Eleanor," he said, using the same phrase he had used in the attorney's office. "At your age, you can't possibly manage the security of a historical artifact like that ledger. It's a massive liability for a woman living alone on the edge of a marsh." Lydia stepped closer to the table, her fingers reaching out to touch the smooth wood. "We're worried about you, Mom. I mean, Eleanor," she said, catching herself. "We think it's best if we move the document to the city, where it can be properly insured. We've already spoken to a curator who specializes in 19th century legal records." Eleanor didn't move from her place by the sink. She watched them with the same calm observation she used to study the ink on an old map. "The ledger isn't going to the city," Eleanor said quietly. Marcus let out a short, frustrated breath and adjusted his silver cufflinks. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Eleanor. That ledger could fix every legal headache we have with the timber lot and the quarry boundaries. It belongs to the Vance family, and as the executors of the primary estate, we have a right to it." Eleanor felt the iron key ring in her apron pocket. The rusted brass tag was warm against her leg. "You gave me this workhouse because you thought it was a disgrace," she said. "You gave it to me because you thought I was a disgrace. But according to the Great Distribution of 1852, this property includes the North Limestone Quarry, the very quarry you were planning to sell to the developers next month." Marcus went very still. The smooth, practiced mask of concern began to crack at the corners of his mouth. "That's impossible," he whispered. "The deeds we have clearly show the quarry as part of the timber lot. Your deeds were written by men who didn't have the original map." Eleanor replied. This workhouse was the surveyor's office for the entire valley. My father knew that. He knew exactly what he was doing when he gave me the keys. Lydia stepped back from the table as if it had suddenly become hot to the touch. We can fix this, Eleanor, she said, her voice rising an octave. We can sell the quarry together and split the proceeds 3 ways. We're family, after all. We should be looking out for each other. Eleanor looked at Lydia's peach-colored lipstick and then at Marcus's gold watch. She thought about the 30 years she had spent in the drafty hallway. She thought about the $42.12 she had held in the rain. I am looking out for the family, Eleanor said. I am looking out for the town that built this valley, and I am looking out for the woman you left on the side of the road. She walked to the back door and held it open. The marsh air was cool and smelled of blooming roses. The ledger stays here, she said. The quarry stays with the workhouse, and you stay on your side of the gate. Marcus opened his mouth to speak, but the look in Eleanor's eyes stopped the words in his throat. It wasn't a look of anger or triumph. It was the look of a woman who finally knew the exact value of everything she possessed. Marcus and Lydia walked out to the silver Mercedes without another word. They didn't look back at the orange bricks or the pale pink roses. The car engine roared to life, kicking up a cloud of grey dust. Eleanor watched the silver blur disappear behind the iron gates. She turned back into her kitchen and closed the heavy oak door. The bolt slid home with a clean, solid click. 1 year after the morning she arrived, the marsh was alive with the sound of goldfinches. The workhouse bricks glowed a soft, sun-baked orange in the April light. A small, hand-painted wooden sign sat at the end of the drive. It read, "The Vance Archive, public hours, 10 to 4. Eleanor stood in the kitchen, pouring tea for 2 elderly men who had driven from the next county. They wanted to see the original survey of the riverbed. She led them into the study, where the great ledger sat under a protective glass case. The room was cool and smelled of old paper and fresh lavender. Eleanor reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the iron ring of keys. The rusted brass tag was smooth now, polished by a year of constant use. She didn't need the keys to unlock the secrets anymore. The secrets were the foundation of the town's peace. The 2 men spoke in hushed tones, their fingers tracing the lines of the 1,852 map through the glass. Eleanor walked to the back door and looked out over the marsh. The North Quarry was silent, protected by the legal weight of the book in the other room. She held the brass tag up to the light. "You knew, didn't you?" she whispered to the wind. "You knew I was the only one who wouldn't sell the soul of this place." She tucked the keys back into her pocket and walked back inside. The house felt warm. Eleanor's journey proved that the world's discards are often the only ones strong enough to carry the weight of the truth. It showed that a life of quiet service is never lost time. It is the training ground for a legacy that eventually outlasts greed. The things that society calls ruins are often the only structures built on foundations that cannot be shaken. Eleanor Vance was 71 years old when she lost everything, and she was 71 years old when she became the most powerful woman in the valley. She didn't need an apology from Marcus or Lydia to be whole. She had the keys, she had the record, and she had the peace of the marsh. If Eleanor's story moved you, if you've ever felt that your years of quiet loyalty were treated as a convenience by those who should have valued you most, leave one word in the comments describing the feeling you had when Eleanor finally turned the key in the great ledger room. Because Eleanor's story proves something that is always true. The value of a person is never determined by those who seek to profit from them, but by the legacy they choose to protect. Share this with someone who needs to remember that their worth isn't tied to their bank account or their productivity in someone else's eyes. Because together, we prove that dreams don't age.